I've seen a lot of people lose the idea that we can actually be agents of systems change. And the reality is you can. How? In part by going to the core of this dynamic that I'm describing here. If money keeps accumulating with the wealthiest, and it does so through for-profit forms of business that are fundamental to capitalism, how do you change that? You move your money, move your debts. Have you thought about, is your money in a not-for-profit bank? Do I even know if my bank is for profit or not for profit? Let's say I have only £5 in my bank account. I might say, you're not talking to me, right? Like I've got no way that creates systems change. But actually, the way that banking systems work, if you move £5 over from a for-profit to a not-for-profit bank, you're moving much more than £5 because of the multiplier effect in terms of capital reserve ratios and all sorts of things.
Welcome to the Moral Footprint podcast. I'm your host, Jeni Miles, and this is where I have conversations with activists and leading thinkers to uncover practical insights for moving from individual to systemic transformation, particularly for those of us in the global north who need to fundamentally rethink how we live and work within ethical and planetary boundaries. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Donnie Maclurcan from the Post-Growth Institute. While we did discuss some big topics like the monetary system, debt, and the need for circulation of power, the big question I was left with was whether the path to social transformation isn't just about thinking our way through the crisis we face, but about attuning to how our body feels. In essence, moving from systems thinking to what Donnie calls systems feeling. We explore how our economic system creates profound disconnection from our bodies, from each other, and from the living systems that sustain us. But we also dive deep into practical alternatives such as cooperatives, Donnie's offers and needs markets methodology, and why moving beyond individual lifestyle changes to systemic money moves, such as changing where your pension lives, might be our most powerful lever for change. Most importantly, we examine what it means to slow down in urgent times, to trust that disquiet within us, and to allow our embodied wisdom to guide us towards what we know deep down is possible. I really hope you get value from our exploration of how reconnecting with our bodies might just be the key to creating the regenerative systems our world desperately needs. So Donnie, welcome to Moral Footprint. It's a real pleasure to have you here. I first came across your work, How on Earth, which is your book with Jennifer Hinton, almost 5 years ago now, and it really helped me grasp that actually is a viable alternative to business as usual. The crux of it is actually shifting business's relationship with profit. Before we dig into that, I'd love to learn a bit more about the path that's brought you to where you are today. You have a background in exercise physiology, nanotechnology, and perhaps we can talk about what led you to where you are today with the Post-Growth Institute.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. It's a question that I ask myself sometimes because I guess life takes us on journeys beyond our control often. And I think that probably like many of your listeners, I'm someone who was always interested in peering under the hood, seeing what was happening underneath. And so from a very early age, growing up in a very wealthy part of the world and the Southern Hemisphere on Camaragal lands in Sydney, Australia, I guess I had always sensed that there were things that just didn't seem right in terms of economics, in terms of justice, in terms of the way that we were relating with each other and the planet. And so that curiosity that very much takes an embodied form, like a sensing, a feeling, a systems feeling, as I describe it, rather than systems thinking so much, sat with me throughout all of my work. And it was just last week I was reflecting on what is the common thread between exercise physiology and nanotechnology and post-growth economics. And a lot of it for me is what do our bodies as part of the natural universe, what do our bodies have to tell us? And my body kept telling me that things could be better, that things worked in certain circumstances, but in other circumstances and writ large were not in harmony with natural laws, were not in harmony with what we know about the need for non-linearity in our systems, the circulation of money, power, and resources. And so after I finished my PhD, and I'd actually been working in social innovation, running a national organization in Australia for about 7 years, that was helping people start, scale, and sustain community projects. And I finished this PhD looking at bio-nanotechnology and what was happening with emerging technology around the world, and continued to come to that conclusion that within capitalist, economic growth-oriented frameworks, that new technologies would consistently widen, exacerbate the inequalities. And so when I invited 9 others to co-found the Post-Growth Institute in 2010, it was from that starting point of the limits to growth, the ecological challenges we were facing. And it has over time, including the work that you're alluding to, often centered back to this notion of what does it mean to circulate money, power, and resources in our society so that we can thrive within ecological limits.
Yeah, so the starting point was actually within your body sensing something wasn't right, and then almost like flipping your trajectory in order to uncover if money is not circulating, if power is consolidating, what is an alternative? And that's probably a good segue to the Post-Growth Institute, because I assumed post-growth as a term was actually quite new, but you're talking about launching, 15 years ago. Was it a term, like, do you know who invented it? How did you even discover what post-growth is?
It's a good question. I'm not actually sure. I think we brought the term
Yeah.
to the world, but there was already Postwachstum in Germany. Technically, it means the same thing, even though we didn't know about that field of work. But
Great.
there's a long history of fields that merge and dovetail and cross over. And one of them that I had been focusing my PhD on from 2003 onwards was post-development. And that was a really interesting academic field because it essentially challenged modernity. It challenged the developmentalist narrative, the what's called the Rostovian path that often led to things such as the idea of developed and developing countries, etc., linear paths towards certain kind of growth. And that's what we were challenging in the early stages of the Post-Growth Institute, was like, hold on a second, these pathways that are laid out as and claimed to be so spectacular, why then is there the kind of inequality that we see growing? Why in Sydney, in one of the wealthiest parts of the world, was I seeing people on the streets working? I was working with people who were living without homes and continuously discovering that there were places where people were falling through the cracks. And I was like, why? Why is that? And the answer is it's baked in to our economic fabric. It's part of the system designed to actually maintain and even exacerbate that inequality, not to anyone's benefit ultimately, especially certainly not the planet's.
Because we end up all suffering with that mentality. Something that's interesting about what you said then is development. It doesn't talk about the root causes. It focuses on symptoms, and then we wonder, why aren't things getting better? And as you say, it's because that externalization, that extractivism is hard baked into it. You've used the word circulation, and a big theme of your work is about rethinking money and how it circulates through society. So could you share a bit about that concept and perhaps how it relates to the work that you do at Post-Growth Institute?
I was at a conference in 2009 in Brisbane, Australia. I remember seeing a gentleman named Colin Saltmere, who was the keynote speaker at this community development event. My work at the time was very much centered on how do you create community resilience? How do you strengthen community resilience, acknowledging that there's already forms of resilience that exist in communities throughout the world, drawing on this asset-based community development approach. And so at this event, this keynote speaker, who was the head of an engineering company, a civil and construction engineering firm called Mayuma, gets up and he said these 5 words that changed the trajectory of my life. He said about his company that was 50 million Australian dollars, 50 employees and about from memory, about 12 million Australian dollar turnover annually, working in with surveying, with bridge building, with training young engineers. He said of his company, we're not for profit. And I'd never maybe quite conceptualized, as I think most of us probably haven't, the idea of an engineering company being not for profit. And what I realized over the subsequent months was that actually I had been working for not-for-profit forms of business all my life, whether that was in my community, whether that was in the sporting world, whether that was to do with mental health counseling, the homelessness services. All of these entities had revenue-generating activities underneath them that were supporting, offsetting, cross-subsidizing their community and social work. And in doing so, it opened up a path. This is before I met Dr. Jennifer Hinton a couple of years later. It opened up this path where I started to look around and see that all around the world there were not-for-profit forms of business. And what do I mean by that? I mean businesses where there's no private individual equity ownership, and the profits essentially, by default of there not being any private individual equity ownership, the profits circulate back in according to the mission of those entities. And here we're talking about 4 particular forms: consumer cooperatives, foundation-owned businesses, government enterprises, and non-profits with business models underneath them. So to your question about circulation, what this started in me was a recognition, an alignment of the things that were feeling out of balance in my childhood, whether that was about money and power. glimpsing that there are actually models, dovetailing with my asset-based community development approach, which is look for what already exists, realizing there were these models that already existed where money naturally circulates. And sure enough, when you look at the places where money naturally circulates, not that they're always perfect, they typically also, it follows that they have a greater circulation of power, flatter
Yes.
organizational structures, these sorts of things. You marry this up then with, those are formal economy examples, you marry that up then with the informal economy and you discover all of these incredible ways that often in part as resistance to imperialism, neo-imperialism, neo-colonialism, genocidal forces, communities have thrived in spite of those kinds of struggles, often through the way that they informally circulate money and power. Ways that mutual aid, for example, or rotating and savings credit associations, and the work of people like Caroline Shanaz Hossain that shines a spotlight on the ways that circulation of money and power is actually inbuilt in so many community cultural practices. And this, to wrap up, is so important because when we conduct experiments, and you may have seen the drawing experiment that I created, that essentially asks people, what does it feel like in an economy that's working for everyone and everything, human and non-human species alike? And then what does the present economy feel? Having now done that experiment with maybe more than 10,000 people all across the world, including in languages other than English, what's interesting is that people consistently draw something non-linear for the future. Right?
That's
They
beautiful.
usually draw one of 5 different things: a circle, an infinity symbol, a spiral, a heart, or a nodular blob. And the reality of that is that it reminds us that we know, just like nature, just like carbon and nitrogen has to cycle, just like in our bodies, blood and oxygen need to cycle.
It's intuitive.
It's intuitive. It's
To
intuitive.
share, to collaborate. And I guess what you're getting at here is what we see as traditional businesses now, they are operating in a completely antithetical way to that. They have CEOs who aren't connected to what people are doing on the ground. You have shareholders who have actually nothing to do with the core operations of the business, who benefit from how the business generates money. And so for me, that's what I find really interesting, that it's almost like, how do we unlearn what we have been told only in the past, presumably, roughly 200 years? Business equals extraction. It includes having a boss. It includes this hierarchy. But what you're saying is that kind of goes against how we as humans naturally want to collaborate.
Yes, certainly in terms of certain types of hierarchies. I mean, I think there are functional hierarchies that are relevant here, but in terms of control-based hierarchies, right, where you have, as you said, bosses that essentially create environments where the idea of collective wisdom being surfaced is just not really on the cards. We have cultures in dominant mainstream societies whereby the idea of following orders, the idea of just out of fear often in terms of career paths and the ultimate threat that can be held over people, which is the firing of someone, right? Like under these pressures, we lose so much. We lose so much creative possibility in terms of ideas and the generative possibility when we actually come in to groups together and share what our embodied wisdom has to say and then run tests on that, whether or not it's wisdom or not. And so to your point, the perceptions, and I know you've got a particular interest with your most recent work with LSE around perceptions, the perceptions of business, quote unquote, is, as you say, it's for profit, right? And by for profit, and this is where this is tricky stuff, because the language of profit in itself is language that has perceptions around it. So when I say for profit, I don't mean the ability to make a profit. I mean the ownership that sits underneath that form of business is private individual equity ownership. In other words, the profit has the capacity to go to those shareholders, whether they are formal shareholders or partners in the business.
Yeah. It's almost like not-for-profit extraction, isn't it? And it kind of goes back to what you're saying about this circulation piece, that because, as you say, so many of these, whether they're cooperatives or otherwise, whether they're foundation, they can generate good amounts of revenue. The difference is the profit they make on that, they can bring back into that mission. Whereas, business that, and again, as someone who worked in big tech for, I don't know, 13, 14 years, it just sounds so completely different to what I know and what I've been trained to think of as business. And I also wanted to add to your point about, that we are used to kind of taking orders from bosses. And it also got me thinking about this idea of embodied, I guess, whether it's cognition or just how that must feel every day to do things that aren't actually tied to what you care about, that you're almost like alienating yourself, aren't you, when you work in this way? And presumably not for profits, the dream, and if we can even imagine this as an alternative, it's giving people the ability to share their own ideas. And I think perhaps then there's some kind of emergence, isn't there? If everyone can collaborate, who knows what business could be?
You're absolutely right. And you make a really good point, is that we're actually trapped in an internal gaslighting. And what do I mean by that? I mean that, to your point, people are often sitting in organizations feeling one thing and being forced to do something else. They're feeling that things don't feel right in that big tech company. And what's missing so often is an awareness of the alternatives. Right? You can't just say to someone, oh, look, and I'm going to pick up on a current point here, right? There's this focus on moral ambition, and you may have encountered some of the work that is starting to be driven there. This idea that people can just move out of certain trajectories, career paths, but that there's something that gets missed there for me, which is critical, which is that without those alternatives being made, people being made aware of those alternatives, that's a big thing to ask someone in this kind of world, which is so debt laden, where the debt burden, if, for example, in the US, where a lot of the moral ambition work is currently focused, where you know that you're coming out of higher education if you've been studying with a significant debt burden most of the time. The idea that you can just put purpose at the center, even if it's not true, is perceived as untrue because of the very setup that through business schools, through high schools, through conversations within families, etc. There's only one way to do business, right? It's business, government, and civil society. Or if you're going to go work for civil society, your pay rates are going to be low and you're just sacrificing things. You're not going to be able to do X, Y, Z. Those stories are just that. They're stories. They're not actually real anymore. But the awareness around those realities, as your study pointed out, the difference between perception and reality is often very vast.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on what you said about business schools as well, because as you know, the research that we did, it showed a statistically significant relationship between the higher the education level, the reduced motivation and capability to want a post-growth world. And I often wonder if that's because, you know, first of all, you're kind of almost being indoctrinated into here's what business is, and the role in life is to accumulate wealth, and who cares about everyone else? Like, if we think about what neoliberal culture tells us. And for me, it also goes back to what you were talking about, one of your experiments that you said you've put 10,000 people through, to even ask the question, can you imagine an alternative? I mean, I have to be honest, I think so many people, they've not even asked themselves that question. What could an alternative future look like? So it also gave me goosebumps when you were saying, what would it feel like if an economy was set up in a way that helped everyone and just had this feeling of abundance? And I got goosebumps. I was like, that's a really nice feeling to even imagine what it could be like.
Well, you raise such great points here in the sense that this is something that we all actually deep down want. I mean, we want to be back aligned. We want to feel in integrity with the planet that we inhabit, that we can actually work in harmony with that. Now, the resistance internally is strong. The resistance culturally, the conditioning is strong. And that point that you highlight from your recent study about the higher the level of education, the less the chance someone feels there is an ability to shift to post-growth pathways is really interesting. I'm going to make an internal reflection on post-growth movements here. I think that's on us to some extent. And the reason is because I see a lot of post-growth literature, work, research, etc., focus on an understanding of post-growth that is much more narrow than I and the Post-Growth Institute would take on. And that focus is often on decarbonization or consumption. And so if your idea of post-growth business is framed in this idea of a business that is trying to reduce from a circular economy kind of angle the amount of things that get produced, then of course that's hard to conceptualize because business, as it's driven often worldwide, so often is about more, like you produce more and you imagine the profits are going to be correlated. Mm-hmm. So the delinking there is difficult for people to understand it. Like if you're in a big tech company, right, how can you imagine from a material circulation side of things, other than using profits to purchase things that can carbon offset, right? It's hard for you if you're working in a cubicle cell on sales, for example, or the coding or these sorts of pieces. What's your relationship to this idea of that business going post-growth if you see it as material consumption? It's tricky. it's tricky to see. But if you go further into what post-growth really means, which is moving towards systems of nonlinearity, right, from a linear-based, growth-based system, then you get to the core of this, which is around monetary circulation, the circulation of power, etc. And you realize what we're talking about here is that big tech company actually shifting its ownership structure, just like Patagonia did, for example, right? Or just like we saw with, gosh, I'm thinking of the email service that just went over to not-for-profit, the
I
Swiss-based
don't think
email
I've come across
service.
that one.
Yeah, I'm just forgetting the name myself. But these transitions, right? Fundamentally, what happens with money in entities is way more important than the actual material flow. The material flows are downstream. What happens with material flows are affected by those ownership structures, etc. And so of those researchers that you're talking to, those folks, or sorry, the people you're interviewing who...
The professionals,
the
the UK
professionals,
business
right?
professionals,
Exactly, right? If they had an understanding of post-growth that was different, who knows whether those results change. But as you say, the conditioning is post-growth, that's going to inhibit things. It doesn't add up to what my experience is, etc. It's hard to make sense of.
Yeah. And also, if the focus is on reducing consumption, that comes across as potentially, oh, I'm going to have to make a sacrifice. But something else I want to add there is it's really interesting because actually many, especially the global north, who do vastly overconsume, they're not actually that happy despite it, And I think also if we can find a way to help the movement show more about this idea of like the concept of enough. If you have enough, you don't have to work 40 hours a week. You can pick up your child from school. You can get to know your neighbors, And I know a lot of what the work that you've done is around community. So I'd love to talk about that in a moment. But I just want to go back to this. You talked about this notion of debt and how, debt is almost intrinsic to our monetary system. It keeps people sort of locked in to this dependency of, I need to keep working at this potentially quite extractive employer because I have debt. But can you talk a bit about why is debt exist? Because it's presumably tied to this idea of extraction.
That's a great question because it's actually not. And so I'm going to flip things a little bit. Yes. So this is what was missing in the How on Earth book in the original draft, which is part of the work I've been working on since.
Yes.
Will be coming out soon. So you said something interesting. You said debt is intrinsic to our monetary system. Actually, it's not. It is and it isn't. The debt expansion is not intrinsic to our money system. Debt expansion, which is the big problem that we face, right? Like the indebtedness of whether it's
with
countries,
the interest rates
households,
and expecting to get more money back.
Well, that's only part of it, actually.
Okay.
The intrinsic piece of debt expansion is because of capitalism, not the actual money system. So let's just go back a little here. Without debt, there's no such thing as money. You have debt on the other side of money, which is the balancing mechanism. Debt's actually a very, very important ingredient in modern economies. You can't have a debt-free system and expect to have a modern market economy. It doesn't exist. The importance of debt, though, changes in terms of how money circulates. And there's quite a bit of theory here that probably is a little too much to go through, and people can look up some of our work on this if interested. But the critical thing to know is that in capitalist systems, debt enters the economy alongside money when money is loaned into existence. When you borrow money to buy a car, for example, or a home loan, or these sorts of things, you have an equivalent debt that is created. What happens in capitalism is that money and debt get permanently separated in the aggregate. What do I mean by that? I mean that money accumulates in the bank accounts of the richest households and businesses. And then the debt that is there in equivalent, including, as you mentioned, the interest on the debt, which is another form of debt, and other ways that debt gets created without new money. And I'm going a little technical here, but various forms of bond issuance.
It's super helpful.
What happens is that you get a whole lot of people, and particularly governments, households, small businesses, sometimes big businesses, that are indebted. And because the money is tied up in bank accounts of the wealthiest, and it's not getting pushed back enough through salaries, through taxation, etc. What happens as a result of that is the indebted in the world have to take on more debt as a way for the economy to continue.
I see.
Primarily is not a function of the monetary system, as a lot of people say. It's actually a function of capitalism. It's why there's no sustainable form of capitalism that produces any form of equality. It doesn't matter how much you tax, right? We hear in a lot of progressive spaces, let's put big taxes on the wealthy, let's put a basic income guarantee into the system. It doesn't matter. If it's still capitalism, you're going to see these dynamics. They're just slowed down and hidden better. It's why we have a problem, a failure of imagination in our sort of left-right politics right now, because all of the imagination in the mainstream is still around a capitalist system. So inequality is baked in to that equation.
Yeah, you need the inequality in order for capitalism to thrive, because it's a feature of it.
You need the inequality for capitalism to thrive, and when capitalism thrives, inequality is created. So it's a loop,
Yes.
right? It's a loop. There's no way of getting out of that in the capitalist system. So where all of this becomes really relevant is like, what is it that you, the listener of this podcast, can actually do to change that system? You may be disenchanted on the back, understandably, of change a light bulb, these sorts of things, which put the focus on individuals to create systems change in ways that were just window dressing for corporate social responsibility. But as a result of that, I've seen a lot of people lose the idea that we can actually be agents of systems change. And the reality is you can. How? In part by going to the core of this dynamic that I'm describing here. If money keeps accumulating with the wealthiest, and it does so through for-profit forms of business that are fundamental to capitalism, how do you change that? You move your money, move your debts, move where you bank your money. Have you thought about, is your money in a not-for-profit bank? Do I even know if my bank is for-profit or not-for-profit? That kind of thing, right?
Yeah, very good point.
Finding this, move your money, move any investments, move any debt that you hold over if possible, refinance it with a not-for-profit institution. And there's other ways, of course, in terms of labor, moving your volunteering, any donations, all of these bits and pieces. These seemingly insignificant. Let's say I have only £5 in my bank account. I might say, you're not talking to me, right? Like I've got no way that creates systems change. But actually, the way that banking systems work, if you move £5 over from a for-profit to a not-for-profit bank, you're moving much more than £5 because of the multiplier effect in terms of capital reserve ratios and all sorts of things. Banks can lend more money than they hold in reserves. So we do have power. We do have agency. What needs to be connected, amongst other things, is this feeling in us that things aren't right. Why aren't they right? Because we don't have a system that is based on circulation inherently. And then we go out and we protest and we try to get power back and create redistribution. But the redistributionary mechanisms are still propping up capitalism.
I completely agree. And I also think, especially for people with some form of monetary privilege, like you say, it could even be just £5, but, you know, I'm sure a lot of people listening are relatively privileged in the global north. And so I'll just give an example. I learned about the Triodos Bank. I think I might have actually learned about it after researching not-for-profit from reading your book. And I was able to switch from HSBC, who are again for-profit, they fund fossil fuels and so on. I was able to switch quite easily. But then I also found out that switching my pension would also have a huge impact compared to me focusing on, you know, I need to be completely vegan, I need to stop using plastic, I need to doing all these things. If I'd put all that energy into my pension, that would make a bigger difference. But what's funny is trying to move my pension from Aviva even into a more sustainable system or a more sustainable fund, it is so difficult. And I think what you're saying here is there are ways we can do this, but it's about almost like decentering lifestyle and thinking about money. Like money is the key thing here.
Yeah, money's the lifeblood of our capitalist economy and indeed market economies in the modern world. And so the point that you're raising, if more people turn their attention to advocacy around where pension funds exist and also the restrictions on the abilities to shift pension funds as well as the options available, that is going to give much better bang for buck in terms of return on investment of time. There's a lot of important advocacy work that happens on the front of lifestyles, etc. But so often it's window dressing, unfortunately, because the root pieces here of how this system advances, of how we continue to be caught up in a culture that tells us you're not enough, you don't have enough, and therefore with status envy, we consume more often. As you mentioned, Jeni, this feeling of so many people with wealth and privilege aren't feeling great. Let's create that alternative where those pressures to do that force us in particular directions that are actually antithetical to life, right? They're not allowing us to go, hold on, I feel like I'm living my values here. I'm living in integrity. How to get out of this mess? Part of that is to actually go to these root causes in our economy and say, well, we need to go to the very source of the tap of this inequality,
yes,
this culture, etc., this hyper consumption. And the only way to do that I know of is to actually outcompete capitalism, to take capitalism into a post-capitalist system by
Yeah, like
ensuring
take the
that
funds. Yeah.
take the funds, right? Take back our economy in very powerful, just like the Welsh water system did many years back, right? Where they floated a bond on the green bond market in Europe that was oversubscribed. A group of people getting together and saying, we want to take this for-profit system back into not-for-profit hands. And that's exactly what they did. Amazing, amazing.
Absolutely. And I would also like add on to that what we were talking about before with business being such a crucial sort of lever of transformation. So for people who are either like in various senior positions in a company, or they want to find ways to almost drive bottoms up support for this change to relationship to profit. There's someone at my door, but I'm just going to ignore them. So I guess my question is around the not-for-profit model more broadly. Could you help us share how that differs from the likes of B Corp and other professed sustainable businesses? Because I think that's another area people don't truly understand.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and you're absolutely right. Like, there's a lot of misinformation, confusion around these sorts of things. And I think it first is worth highlighting, like if you're listening to this podcast and you hear me say not for profit, my experience suggests that there's a chances that you're thinking I'm saying non-profit or no profit, right? And to the point earlier, not for-profit forms of business can make unlimited revenue. It's what happens with the funds, amongst other things that are important. So what's interesting here is that almost universally around the world, across different legal structures, you have very different legal systems, different forms of jurisprudence, all different bits and pieces. But interestingly, even through the Islamic law, for example, you have similar kinds of understanding of what not-for-profit means. And essentially it comes back to this piece around ownership. And there's, technically speaking, there's this bundle of rights approach that includes both what happens with the finances and also the decision making. But what's critical in all of this, in my opinion, is more the finance piece. In other words, who has a stake, who has an equity piece in a business, right? And so just to be clear, when we're talking post-growth business, we're not talking about small businesses here, like as in sole proprietors, etc. We're talking about at the level of incorporated businesses when you would have the capacity for stock ownership of a business, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so a not-for-profit business is any business that is without private individual equity ownership. That means that the primary purpose of the business is some kind of social or environmental focus, right? That's it. Its primary focus is not to make money. It will make money in order to operate as a business. And to be clear here, we're distinguishing between non-profits that are not businesses, so your typical traditional charities, versus
who don't generate their own revenue.
Right, who don't generate their own revenue, which, by the way, there's very few of them these days. But when we're comparing that with forms of business where, as we describe it, more than 50% of the revenue is self-generated. So going back to my memory of the UK. So, well, let's take the co-op, for example, right? Obviously had a bit of a rocky history over the last few years, but just over the last few years took back the bank, right? It was a bank that got privatized and it's now fully back in ownership under that cooperative. Nobody owns that bank then. There's no individual equity ownership. You can be a co-op member, you get your dividends perhaps, or your discounts, which is essentially a way of saying we don't want to overcharge you as a member. And that's a form of a not-for-profit bank. You have the Co-Wheels car company, you have the YHA, right? These businesses that exist without any private individual ownership. And that distinction from B Corp, which is a certification which can cut across different forms of business, that doesn't say you have to be owned in a particular way, or terms like social enterprise, doesn't distinguish even the term cooperative. You can have for-profit cooperatives. So what's beautiful about not-for-profit versus for-profit languaging is it connects the dots with this piece we're describing in terms of capital accumulation. Problems that underpin our global economies right now and climate change, etc., fundamentally come back to capital continues to accumulate in our systems, therefore debt accumulates elsewhere, therefore we have inequality. Within that inequality, we have the conditions for a narrative to push very easily of you're not enough, you have to consume more to feel enough. And that dynamic can be addressed when we look at what happens with the ownership structures, and not-for-profit is the easiest way universally to look at something that's agreed upon that's hard to co-opt, just like
before we move on to talk about this shift from like consumer identity to producer, because you just talked about like consumption, I just want to circle back on to one of the points from my research, which actually shows the majority of business professionals do actually agree and align with post-growth business practices. So I guess my call to action there from this podcast as well is that your peers, if you're listening and you work in this company who perhaps doesn't have this idea of circulation, doesn't have this democratic ownership, you might be mistaken and you might not realize, but there are other people who will likely agree because it's intuitive. It's as we've said before, is how humans likely want to, I guess, collaborate in the first place. So I want to just pivot now to something that you launched that has been hugely successful, the offer and needs sort of market and the methodology, because it feels like that is very much around moving away from this capitalized idea of just extracting things from people, but it's about this sense of like social trust and reciprocity. Could you maybe share what led you to create this methodology and a bit more about how it works and maybe any success stories?
Yeah, thanks, Jeni. The offers and needs market has been a huge success. We have almost 430 facilitators now across the world of this 2-hour experience where people come together and they get to share, whether it's virtually or in person, what they're offering and what they need from each other, with qualifiers on that, like how available is the offer, how urgent is the need, etc. And people share everything from like something you might see as insignificant, like I'm offering a hug, through to I'm offering a place to stay or a job, or I'm needing a car for purchase, these sorts of things. I've seen so many offers and needs matched. I mean, on average, people come out of these experiences with close to five offers and needs matched. And it can be, as mentioned, I've seen people get jobs and move into different careers as a result of this. Gosh, one couple even got married as a result of this experience. I'm going to go to a strange example, but it goes to sort of the heart of some of the things we've been talking about in terms of realigning our lives personally and professionally within ethical boundaries. One of the earliest offers and needs markets that I ran, about 13, someone said to the group, I'm needing a Ferrari. Now, here I am with the Post-Growth Institute facilitating this experience, and that's like heavy to hear in the sense of like, all right, that in my perception, that fits a particular narrative that is the kind that we're trying to change. But I wasn't going to like jump in, and of course not. Like, the whole thing is that if that's what you're saying you're needing, then we want to honor that and see what
And
happens.
if someone can offer a Ferrari, let's go for it.
Well, it got even better. There was a woman in the circle who responded to this man who was asking for a Ferrari and said, my husband runs the high performance vehicle day out at Eastern Creek, the track. And I discovered later that he went and he had a day in the Ferrari, and actually that's all he wanted and needed, right? It's so interesting.
Reframing what the need is.
Exactly right. Is the need a Ferrari, or is the need to like have some kind of experience that touches some kind of deep, emotional need, etc. And so these reframing pieces, this is to your point, Jeni, like what's possible when communities get together and we get to know our neighbors in safe containers, right? It's one thing you see a lot of people saying, like, get to know your neighbors, build community, all of these things. That freaks a lot of people out significantly, right? We often need community facilitators to help people on a journey, especially if you're coming in with the conditioning that I suspect we all hold of, I'm not enough, I don't have enough, and there's not enough for us all.
That's artificial scarcity.
Absolutely. To then be eased into an experience that flips that and shows you, oh, you've got so many things to offer this world, not just things that are related to your professional capabilities and not just things that are there for extraction, right? That's another thing. If I'm going to offer, what happens if everyone wants it and takes it, right? No, you've got to be very careful in this process of easing people through the trauma of late stage capitalism to actually reconnect with aspects of mutuality that we know we want, but are hard to often get to because of all of these perception barriers and assumptions that come in. And also because there's been lots of experiments of community facilitation that have gone wrong, where people have ended up, being stalked by someone or having a situation where they got into a dispute, etc. So it's a tender space.
You need that container because we haven't been trained to be in a relational way with people.
Well, you're right. Although I would make a qualifier that when we say we here, we're often talking about white culture, right?
Yes, totally.
In non-white bodies, non-white communities, there's still so often throughout the world, and even in certain white communities as well. I'm thinking even just here off the top of my head of like the Amish and how they operate, for example. I remember reading a book, I think Switched Off is the name, and it said like, how do the Amish show up to each other's door? They don't say, hi, how are you? They say, hi, how can I help? And they then build the relationship around that shared value. But back to the point of the racialized aspect here, in individualistic white supremacist meritocracy culture, we see this push for the individual as the island, etc. But in cultures throughout the world, indigenous and non-indigenous, cultures of color in particular, we see that maintenance of mutuality so often. It's what the Weird study, if anyone's interested in looking into this, just highlight. It was one of the most profound studies that I've ever encountered is the Weird study, WEIRD. And what it highlighted was that pretty much all the dominant theories of economic behavior, when actually tested across different cultures outside of white industrialized populations, students from universities in the US, for example, when it tested outside of that, it realized that these claims we make about human behavior were not true in their limitations of how it was described.
No, just for a subset of actually what we would call the global minority. It just so happens to be that that culture is what has pervaded the globe and is now causing planetary overshoot. Something that has just connected from what you're saying, your article on Medium, Healing from the Separation of Patriarchal Capitalism. And there's a quote that I wanted to share your take on it. Our bodies hold wisdom surpassing rational thought, which is anathema to a patriarchal world, especially if your identity is based on denying it. And that article was about these white billionaires flying into space and pretending that that was the equivalent of progress. How and why does capitalism disconnect us from this bodily wisdom? Because from what you're saying with your own journey, that is such a crucial part of us even sensing something isn't right and we can change it.
It's a great question. The speed, the cult of speed associated with capitalism barely gives us a chance to be in our bodies. Even if you're listening to this podcast, for example, I encourage to just pause the podcast if you're needing to like take something in, right? See how something's landing for you in your body, especially in a world that is filled with the digital, where content is bombarding us in all sorts of ways unless we're carefully protecting ourselves from these things. We're constantly forced with information, often in words or written form, coming into our orbit. We're forced to actually go up into our heads and intellectualize our response to things, even as we are feeling so much underneath. That's what capitalism does, is it creates the real scarcity in people's lives in terms of the debt burden, etc., in terms of not having enough, and then overlays artificial scarcity on top, right? So it's a double whammy. It says not only we're going to ensure you don't have enough to survive. We're going to tell you that that's the default of the system. That's the way the world is. There's not enough. Now, the reality is there are certain things of which there isn't enough, like fossil fuels, for example, or the capacity of our environment to remediate the impacts of fossil fuel use. These things are finite. But why does capitalism and how does capitalism take us into this disembodied, disconnected way? Because that's the situation in which we're most vulnerable for exploitation. When we connect with our bodies and we say, hold on a second, right? What's going on here? And we see this, I see this in particular modeled by mothers all around the world, right? In moments of craziness where things are going on, especially if kids are involved, they're like, hold on a second, stop. This doesn't feel safe, etc. Right? And they'll step in, calling the emperor on not having any clothes. And that doesn't happen enough because of the power dynamics that capitalism sets up, because the bosses, are creating supporting environments in which it's hard to be courageous in this world and say, this doesn't feel right. And I might not even have the alternatives. All I know is that it doesn't feel right, right? That's another very dangerous thing, is to be able to say something doesn't feel right. The next thing that often people will say is, well, what's the alternative? And if you don't have the answers, then in a world that focuses on rational kind of emphasis,
all up in the head,
all up in the head, well, if you don't have the answers, why are you speaking up? That way that we actually maintain patriarchy, and by patriarchy, I'm talking about the separation between the masculine and the feminine, the domination that occurs in that way of devaluing what someone's feeling or sensing in a moment. It's a huge disservice. The beautiful flip side is that as we reconnect, as we create spaces of silence, spaces for actually going into the embodied, I'm going to be a little bold here and say I'm not just talking about mindfulness. I'm talking about dropping even further than the cognitive into like, what are you feeling throughout your whole body? The more we encourage that in workplaces, the more that we encourage that in relationships with each other, in family environments, the more we will feel our way through to what to do next. That's the beauty of this, is that our bodies so often know the answers if we give them the space and the time and have the co-regulated support with others to actually explore that. It's why I love
Yeah.
sociocracy as a methodology in organizational decision making, because it gives the spaciousness for people's wisdom to come through their bodies.
Yeah, and it's about feeling, not thinking.
Yeah, it's focusing on the feeling in order to connect the thinking to the feeling, right?
Yeah.
It starts with a de-emphasizing of the thinking because that's our training, moves to the feeling, and then says, how do we now feel and think together, but from the space of centering the feeling? And the thinking is almost the analysis on top of the feeling.
Yeah, I love that, because coming from a corporate world, I have been trained to have this toxic productivity, to learn the most and to, get promoted and to have the most knowledge. As I started to become more aware of systems breaking and how maybe I also am complicit in that through how I was working, how I was thinking, it has taken me a long time to realize how I show up, give myself space to think and to breathe is actually the most powerful thing I can do. It's not about accumulating all the knowledge and showing that I'm the most productive. And it's also a journey, isn't it? You don't all of a sudden wake up and then you're completely, truly embodied and have this sense of alignment.
This will be, for all of us, a lifetime journey, right? Healing from the separation of patriarchal capitalism is going to take generations, generations and generations. If you feel rushed in your workplace or your learning environment or in your home, etc., then chances are there are forms of oppression that you're participating in, sometimes outside of your control, right? Because of the system. But if we go back to rushed workplaces, what does that mean? That means that decisions are getting made without the spaciousness to actually have the time to feel into things. That doesn't serve anybody. I know it might sound naive because people say, well, look, how are you going to be competitive in a world if you're creating space to just feel into things all the time, etc.? That's like super slow. You're going to get outcompete. Dot, 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 dot. Look, tell you this from lived experience in the Post-Growth Institute and watching other organizations embrace this kind of approach. The slower you go, the smoother the relationships, both with oneself internally, right? That dissonance we were talking about before, and each other, faster the actual decision making occurs in terms of decisions that you feel are
Clarity.
aligned, the clarity, right? The sense of camaraderie that comes with actually coming to a shared space where everyone goes, is there anything else that people want to add? And everyone's like, that's it. That feels right to all of it. Boom.
Yeah.
How often does that happen in workplaces versus a boss just going, right, so we're doing this, good, done.
Yeah, that feels like a really optimistic way of imagining how we could get to a post-growth transformation that is truly sort of scaled, because we actually, considering the urgency, I want to say the urgency of our time, it actually requires us to slow down beyond being more thoughtful and slowing down for that clarity. Where you will see the greatest leverage points to changing this paradigm? If there's any particular organizations or just ways of being, I think that you'd love to sort of wrap up the podcast with.
You mentioned that the times are urgent, we need to slow down. That is commonly associated with biokomalofe. I feel that seeking sources of inspiration from outside of perhaps one's own field, or let's say you're listening to podcasts of a particular kind, moving more, if you haven't already, into the somatic or the embodied. The US, for all of its faults, has some wonderful podcasters, especially in this space. I'm thinking here about the Aorta Collective and Bliss Collective, but also Adrienne Marie Brown's work and others in the emergent strategy space that really uplift the importance of attentiveness to the somatic, what's happening in our bodies in various moments. So I think that giving spaciousness, even as a little very minor point, reflecting on how often we use the words I think versus I feel. That's been a big one in my life that I'm constantly trying to track, even in this interview. Like, how often am I saying I think? And because even though it sounds like semantics, if I notice that and then I can say, how do I feel? It can reconnect me with how am I feeling right now in this call? Where's the information coming from?
Yeah.
Is it coming just from my head and responding to you, or is it coming from my heart? And so I'd encourage people to just go as slowly as they need to, be as gentle as you need to be, with the inability to be gentle in these spaces, because we've got a lot of conditioning around speed, disembodied rational thought, having the answers, finding the way forward,
Yes.
through analysis. And there's so much more. There's a whole other world in our bodies, inviting us, beckoning us to come back, to remember who we really are. And as we do, as we travel on that journey together, whole worlds open up that we didn't even think possible.
Yeah, I can actually feel my chest expand as you're saying that. Like, it just sounds so hopeful. And thank you as well for helping me connect the dots between system thinking and system feeling, because ultimately, so many people who are working in the climate or social justice space, they're using their head and they're trying to solve problems, but they're not actually in touch with their own body. They're not attuned to how they're feeling. So for me, that's been a really interesting insight from today's call as well.
Well, it's been delightful to be here with you, Jenny, and your listeners. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.